You're listening to Murder Not Murdering with Aaron,
and Autumn,
a true crime podcast about murder and murdering.
but we are not murderers.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to Murder Not Murdering with Aaron and unfortunately not Autumn. I know, bummer. But listen, I've got a really fun case for you tonight. I say fun because this is one of those cases that sticks out in my mind and I think of it all the time. I know that many of you know, in case you're a new listener, I own two bars, a bar restaurant, and a bar that's within my roller skating rink that I own here in Seattle. And this case just resonates with me because it involves business owners and corruption and craziness. And it's one that I talk about with fellow business owners. I just can't get it out of my mind. And it all takes place with a fake tavern. So I thought for tonight, I used to do wine and crime with Aaron when Autumn was away, where I would talk about a crime that took place at a winery with winemakers, something of that nature, sometimes involving murder, sometimes conspiracies, and I would drink wine and tell you about it. So tonight, it's night for me. It might be good morning to you. It might be good afternoon. I don't know when you're listening, but for me, it is nighttime and I'm sitting in the studio by myself. And I figured since I am going to be doing a case about a tavern, I would crack open a beer and drink it throughout the episode. Don't worry, I will not be doing any ASMR slurping or anything like that. I think that is obnoxious and I'm not here for it, and that's okay. If you like it, more power to you. But I thought I would crack the beer on air so you can hear what I'm drinking. Tonight, I'm going to be having a German-style Pilsner from Future Primitive Brewing, which happens to be just down a few blocks from me here in White Center. So if you're in White Center, Washington, or you are in other places across Seattle, if you get a chance to try Future Primitive Brewing, they have some really great beers. We have rotating ones at both of my businesses, especially because we love to support other local businesses. This particular one has a fantastic name. It's called Nazi Punks Fuck Off. And I just love that. I love that they always stand for something with their business and they're super nice people to work with. They have amazing rotating beers that feature local bands and local organizations. They do a lot for our community. So we really love Future Primitive. If you get a chance to check them out, do. And right now, I'm going to crack my beer and then I'm going to tell you quite a story. So buckle up, get ready, because here we go. Yep, that's still tasty. Okay, so we're going to start with the story of the Mirage, the tavern that set a trap. Chicago, a city of nearly 3 million people, a city of steel mills, elevated trains, and lake effect wind. With neighborhood taverns, political ward bosses, machine politics, and where cops on the beat, politicians, judges, and gangsters could all be in each other's pockets. Chicago was a city where a person could get something done, and getting something done could mean knowing the right person. In this instance, knowing which city employee would be willing to accept a little cash in exchange for deciding that something that was very obviously wrong was actually perfectly fine. And if you owned a small business, that could become a very expensive way to operate because every business needed permits, every business needed inspections, every business had rules. And according to a growing number of Chicago business owners, there were people who knew exactly how to make those rules disappear for some cold hard cash. The problem was proving it, because nobody wanted to go on record. Not when the person they were accusing could potentially come back tomorrow with a clipboard, a citation, a revoked permit, or some other creative way to make their lives miserable. So one Chicago reporter came up with a completely insane idea. She decided that if nobody was willing to tell her what was happening, she would become the business owner. She would open a tavern riddled with violations, a tavern that frankly probably should have been condemned before anyone ordered a drink. And then she would wait. She would wait for the inspectors to show up, and she would see what really happened, because this wasn't a bar, it was a trap. And the name they gave it was almost too perfect: the Mirage. Tonight on Murder Not Murdering, we're not murdering anyone. We're opening a bar, and we are finding out just how cheap corruption can be. To understand the Mirage Tavern, we need to understand the city where it happened. Chicago in the late 1970s was not the Chicago of skyscraper tourism and deep dish Instagram posts. This was a city dealing with enormous changes. The post-war industrial economy was struggling. Factories were closing. Neighborhoods were changing. The population was shifting, and politically, Chicago was still deeply associated with the political machine built during the long tenure of Mayor Richard J. Daley. The post-war industrial economy was struggling. Factories were closing. Neighborhoods were changing. The population was shifting. And politically, Chicago was still deeply associated with the political machine built during the long tenure of Mayor Richard J. Daley. Daley died in December 1976 after more than 2 decades as mayor. He had been succeeded by Michael Bilandic. And although Daley was gone, the political culture associated with his administration certainly hadn't evaporated overnight. Chicago politics had long been famous for its ward organizations' patronage, connections, favors, and relationships. That doesn't mean every city employee was corrupt. It doesn't mean every politician was corrupt. And it certainly didn't mean Chicago was uniquely corrupt. But there was a deeply established public perception that knowing how the system worked mattered. And for small business owners, that could be a terrifying reality. Because imagine you own a neighborhood bar. You have rent, employees, inventory, licensing, taxes, utilities, insurance, customers. And then a city inspector walks through your door. He finds something wrong. Maybe there's a wiring problem. Maybe it's the plumbing. Maybe there are violations involving the building. You don't have a lot of money. You don't have a lot of political influence. And then someone tells you, there's another way. You could fix the problem, or you could pay for that problem to go away. That was the allegation reporters kept hearing. But there's a problem. Nobody wanted to be the person who said it publicly. Pam Zeckman had been hearing these complaints for years. Zeckman was an investigative reporter who had previously worked at the Chicago Tribune before moving to the Chicago Sun-Times. She repeatedly heard from small business owners who said inspectors were demanding bribes. But when she tried to investigate, the business owners backed away. And honestly, you can understand why. If you're telling a reporter that a city inspector is shaking you down, you're not just telling a story about somebody else. You're putting your own business at risk. So Zekman eventually came to a conclusion. If the victims wouldn't talk, the reporters would have to become the victims. As Zekman later explained, the idea essentially was to start their own business and see what happened. And there was one obvious business that they could operate: a bar. Why a bar? Because a bar was perfect. There were numerous agencies and inspectors who could potentially have jurisdiction over it: building inspectors, electrical inspectors, fire inspectors, health inspectors, liquor officials, and all of the people involved in licensing, taxes, and regulation. The Mirage would become a little laboratory, a very filthy laboratory, but a laboratory nonetheless. And Zekman had the support of the Chicago Sun-Times and the Better Government Association, a Chicago watchdog organization. They began to look for a tavern. They were looking for a place that had problems, insurmountable violations, and eventually they found it. At 731 North Wells Street, near the corner of Wells and Superior, sat a rundown tavern. And when I say rundown, I mean this place was basically begging to become evidence. There were visible frayed electrical wires, problems with the plumbing, rats, roaches, a leaky ceiling, a basement with garbage and raw sewage. You guys, there was maggots. These are all serious code violations. Basically, the goal was to find out whether inspectors would overlook the obvious violations, and if they did, the reporters would have hit the jackpot. They bought the place, and I think it's hilarious and brilliant that they named it the Mirage. I mean, come on. The purchase itself was part of the deception. Pam Zekman and the Better Government Association investigator, Bill Rechtenwald, posed as a married couple. They became Mr. and Mrs. Ray Patterson. And suddenly, these two mysterious new bar owners had a business. They had a tavern. They had a cover story. They had employees. And they had a problem. They had no idea how to run a bar, which is where investigative journalism really separates itself from the average career path. Zay Smith went to bartending school because he was planning to expose municipal corruption. He became part of the undercover operation. He would work behind the bar. BGA investigator Jeff Allen also worked undercover. Sun-Times photographers Jim Frost and Gene Pesek were involved as well, and their job was one of the most important parts of this operation. They had to document what had happened, because a story saying city inspectors are corrupt is one thing. A photograph showing a city inspector accepting money while standing in front of a dangerous violation is something completely different. The photographers built hidden observation areas. Frost and Pesek were positioned above and behind part of the tavern, essentially creating a secret lookout. There was a hole in the wall. A vent concealed the opening, and through that opening, they could photograph what happened below. This was 1977. There are no smartphones, digital cameras, wireless security system, Ring doorbells, no convenient little button to hit record. This was photography, film, equipment, and careful planning. One of the photographers later recalled essentially creating a journalistic deer blind. And the Mirage had another important rule. They could not solicit bribes. This was extremely important. The reporters could not walk up to an inspector and say, "Hey, pal, how much would it cost you to ignore this electrical fire hazard?" Because they couldn't create the corruption. They had to just document it. They had to be patient and run a bar in the meantime. The operation got a major boost when the fake bar owners met a man named Phil Barash. Barash was an accountant and what the reporters came to think of as kind of a Mr. Fix-It. He was, according to the reporting, remarkably open about how the system worked. Zekman and Rechtenwald encountered Barash while they were shopping for taverns. He wasn't exactly shy. He offered to help them with their taxes. He offered to explain how to deal with inspectors. And he was apparently more than happy to explain the unofficial rules of Chicago business. This is exactly what the reporters needed, because suddenly they had someone who could help them navigate the system that they were trying to investigate. Barash allegedly explained that the business owners could leave cash in envelopes for inspectors, $10, $20, whatever was appropriate. The amounts weren't large, and that was part of what made this story so shocking. The corruption wasn't necessarily some enormous movie style payoff involving suitcases full of cash. It was often much smaller, 10, 15, 50, sometimes $100. The Mirage reporters later described the system as something resembling a supermarket approach to bribes: low prices, high volume. And the reason that mattered was because the system didn't require one gigantic criminal conspiracy. It required a lot of small decisions, a lot of people willing to say, sure, a lot of people willing to look the other way, willing to decide that the problem wasn't really a problem, and if everyone took a little. But apparently, little things add up. Now imagine walking into the Mirage. It's a bar. It's supposed to be a business. But the people running it know something you don't. They know they're sitting on a pile of violations. They know the basement is disgusting. They know the wiring is bad. They know the place isn't remotely somewhere you'd want to have a responsible inspector approve. And somewhere upstairs, behind a wall, 2 photographers waited with cameras. Then an inspector walked through the door. The first thing the reporters had to do was play dumb. Rechtenwald later recalled that the more clueless they acted, the more people seemed willing to explain how things worked. And that was one of the stranger aspects of undercover work. Sometimes the easiest way to get information from someone is to convince them that you're the dumbest person in the room, which for a journalist might be a deeply satisfying acting exercise. The inspectors came in, they looked around, and the envelopes appeared. One fire inspector took $10, and according to the reporting, he did so without meaningfully examining the exposed electrical wiring. The wiring was visibly bad, and yet $10 was apparently enough to make the problem disappear. The building inspector was somewhat more thorough. He noticed problems. He looked around. And then he took $15. No citation, no major confrontations, just $15 and out the door. The public safety of Chicago, $15 at a time. The state liquor inspector apparently wanted more, $50. That was a premium. Apparently, liquor regulation was a luxury service. And then there was the inspector who didn't take the money. The health inspector reportedly approved the establishment without examining the filthy basement or getting particularly close to the questionable bathrooms. But he didn't accept the bribe. So as Pam Zeckman later put it, he wasn't corrupt. He was just incompetent, which is an important distinction. Not a reassuring one, but important. This is where the Mirage story gets absolutely absurd. Because the more inspectors arrived, the more obvious it became that the problem wasn't one bad apple. There were patterns. These are different inspectors, different departments, different violations, and completely different amounts, but the same basic transaction. During all of this, the photographers, they were there, hidden above the bathroom, shooting through the opening, capturing the money changing hands, capturing the people involved in documenting the encounters. This wasn't some business owner told us this happened, or we heard from a source who heard from another source. That is the inspector. Here is the violation. There is the money. And this is the photograph. And here's what happened next. And the Mirage wasn't just exposing bribery. It started exposing an entire ecosystem. Because once you have a business where inspectors can be paid to overlook violations, someone is going to figure out that taxes can also be manipulated. And this is where Phil Barash comes back into the story. The cash business has one particular problem for people who want to cheat on their taxes. Cash can leave a paper trail, but only if you let it. So accountants became an important part of the Mirage investigation. The reporters began investigating whether accountants would offer ways to conceal income. And again, they found that the practice appeared to be more widespread than a single person. Accountants reportedly offered to help the business skim percentages of their cash receipts. 20%, 30%, 40% of their receipts. I can't believe this. And suddenly, the Mirage wasn't just a story about corrupt inspectors. It was a story about a culture. And that's what made the Mirage so powerful. It didn't merely show individual wrongdoing. And then there were other details, because a good Chicago tavern apparently needed a pinball machine and a jukebox. And the Mirage investigation showed that even the people involved with the machines were apparently willing to explain ways to skim money. They were also asking for shakedowns. This is where the story becomes almost comically comprehensive. The reporters had gone into the investigation looking for bribery by inspectors. But the deeper they went, the more they found: tax evasion, skimming, shakedowns, officials willing to overlook violations, middlemen explaining how to navigate the system. The Mirage was becoming less like a bar and more like a corruption trade show. Come on in, have a beer, ask about our complimentary guide to municipal bribery. And here's the thing: the reporters weren't creating these opportunities. They were creating a business environment in which the existing system revealed itself. That distinction became extremely important later, because after the stories came out, some people would accuse the reporters of entrapment. But the journalists argue that they hadn't offered the bribes. They hadn't walked around saying, "Who wants to commit a crime?" They simply operated a business with obvious violations and waited to see what officials would do. And here's the crazy part: the Mirage operated for only a few months. That's right. This ecosystem revealed itself so quickly, it blows my mind. Because it wasn't some years-long business operation. It was an undercover investigation. The reporters had a limited amount of time and resources. They had to maintain the cover. They had to keep the bar operating. They had to document what happened, and they had to make sure the whole thing didn't collapse. One funny story that I read in the beginning of opening the Mirage: a regular had to instruct the bartender how to properly pour a beer. Because as a journalist, they had never been behind a bar before. And trust me, there is an art to a lot of what happens behind the bar top. Meanwhile, they were dealing with an establishment that was, by design, disgusting. The reporters deliberately did not correct any of the problems because fixing the violations would defeat the purpose. That means the rats were part of the experiment, the shoddy plumbing, part of the experiment, electrical problems that could catch on fire at any minute, part of the experiment, that disgusting maggot-filled basement, you guessed it, part of the experiment. The Mirage was a controlled test. What happens when you put a badly run business in front of a system that's supposed to regulate it? Do the inspectors shut it down? Do they issue citations? Do they demand repairs? Or do they take the money and move along with their day? Because this story would never have happened if they all were just doing their jobs. Unfortunately, the answer to all of those questions repeatedly was take the money, move on. Then came January 1978. Mysteriously, the Mirage closed. The reporters had their evidence. Their job was done. Now came the part that journalists dream about, the part where you take months of secret work and put it on the front page. On January 8th, 1978, the Chicago Sun-Times published the first installment of its Mirage investigation. This wasn't a little story buried on page 17. It became a major investigative series. It had 25 parts. That's right, a 25-part installment documenting what the reporters had discovered. And the first stories were explosive. The photographs, the names, departments, money, violations, and descriptions of inspectors allegedly accepting the payoffs. I mean, you can see them in the pictures. We'll post them on Instagram. The public could see what the reporters had seen all along, and Chicago reacted. The story spread nationally, then internationally. And one evening, something else happened. After the Super Bowl, CBS's 60 Minutes aired its own segment about the Mirage. And Mike Wallace interviewed Phil Barash. Wallace was not exactly known for being someone to skirt around the big questions. He questioned him about the tax practices that the reporters had uncovered, and Barash was remarkably candid. Literally told them everything. The segment gave the Mirage investigation an audience far beyond Chicago, and suddenly this fake little tavern on Wells Street wasn't just a newspaper story. It was national news, and the world was watching. Once the stories were published, the consequences started coming. Inspectors were suspended, some were fired, some were disciplined, and investigations expanded. The federal government now became involved. The IRS sent agents to examine tax fraud involving cash businesses. The Illinois Department of Revenue created what became known as the Mirage Audit Unit, specifically to investigate the kind of tax problems that were exposed in the investigation. And the federal investigation into the city electrical inspectors led to numerous indictments. Reports differ in exactly how the totals are described, but contemporary and retrospective accounts agree that a significant portion of Chicago's electrical inspectors came under indictment in the aftermath. One commonly cited figure was 29 electrical inspectors. Another retrospective account describes it as roughly 1/3 of the city's electrical inspectors. Either way, that's a lot of fucking inspectors. If your department is supposed to make sure that Chicago's electrical systems are safe, and suddenly a large portion of your department is facing massive bribery allegations, you've got a management problem there. The Mirage also contributed to changes in city inspection procedures and code enforcement. The investigation had done something journalism doesn't always accomplish. It didn't just produce a story, it produced consequences. And now we're going to get to a kind of uncomfortable part. Because the Mirage was groundbreaking journalism, but it was also deceptive journalism. The reporters lied about who they were. They created a fake business. They used aliases. They secretly photographed people. They deliberately created a situation designed to test whether people would accept bribes. And that raised a serious ethical question. Did the Mirage expose corruption, or did it encourage people to commit corruption? And that question followed the investigation all the way to the Pulitzer Prize. The Mirage team was considered to win a Pulitzer. The work had earned enormous acclaim, but not everyone on the board thought that it deserved the award. Eugene Patterson, the then president and editor of the St. Petersburg Times, argued that the investigation had an element of entrapment. And Ben Bradley, the legendary executive editor of the Washington Post, opposed giving the Sun-Times the Pulitzer. His position was blunt. He said, and I quote, "The Washington Post instructs its reporters not to misrepresent themselves, period." That disagreement wasn't trivial. It represented a larger debate of what journalism was allowed to do in the pursuit of truth. Can a reporter lie to expose a lie? Can a reporter create a situation in which corruption becomes visible? Does the public interest justify deception? Or does journalism lose something important when journalists become actors in the story? Those questions didn't begin with the Mirage, and it certainly didn't end with it. But the Mirage became one of the most famous examples in American journalism history. The defense of the Mirage was relatively straightforward. The reporters didn't invent the corruption. They didn't tell inspectors, here's $10, look the other way. They just waited. The business itself was real. The violations were very real. And the inspectors had a legitimate duty to inspect. The money came into the picture after the inspectors arrived, and the reporters just documented what happened. In other words, if the system was clean, the Mirage would have been a spectacular failure. Imagine the alternative. Imagine the inspector walks in. He sees the wiring, the plumbing, the putrid basement, and he looks at the owners and says, "You're going to have to fix all of this before you can open." The reporters would have gone back to the newsroom with a very boring story. If Chicago inspectors are doing their jobs and nobody takes a bribe, the end. Instead, money started appearing. $10 here, $15 there. And repeatedly, the nature of those encounters was what made this investigation so powerful. The reporters eventually came to understand that amounts were often surprisingly small. And that might be the most disturbing part because we tend to imagine corruption as expensive. We picture suitcases, secret meetings, huge checks, politicians being brought in for giant sums of money. But the Mirage showed something different, a system that doesn't necessarily need huge bribes. It can survive on small ones. If enough people participate, $10 to even $100 doesn't sound like that much. But multiply that by hundreds of businesses, thousands of transactions, years of behaviors, and suddenly you're looking at something much larger. The Mirage investigation suggested that corruption could operate almost like a service industry. Need an inspection? There's a fee. Need the books to look different? There's a person for that. Need someone to help navigate the system? I know a guy. And because everyone knows how it works, no one has to explain very much. You just have to know who to ask. One of the most fascinating consequences of the Mirage wasn't just what happened to the inspectors, it was what happened to the public. After the series began running, readers started contacting the Sun-Times. People who had their own stories, business owners who said they'd experienced similar behaviors, people who had been afraid to speak before. The Mirage had given them something they hadn't had, evidence that it wasn't only happening to them. If everyone believes they're the only person being shaken down, they may pay. If everyone believes everyone else is paying, they might pay even faster. But once people start comparing notes, the system becomes visible. And that's what investigative journalism is supposed to do. Take something that looks like a series of unrelated incidents and show the pattern. Eventually, the Mirage was sold. The fake business disappeared. The physical location remained. And today, that address is associated with a real tavern. The Mirage itself is gone, but the story stuck. 40 years later, in 2018, former members of the investigation gathered again. Pam Zeckman, Zay Smith, Bill Rechtenwald. Photographers Jim Frost and Gene Pesic were remembered as part of the team that made the investigation possible. And the people who had once hidden behind walls and worked undercover in a filthy bar could finally tell even more stories about what had happened. The photographs became historical artifacts. The investigation became legendary. And journalism had changed. Technology changed. Ethics and economics had changed. But the same basic question remained. What are journalists willing to do to expose something the powerful did not want exposed? The Mirage didn't end corruption in Chicago. Let's not get carried away. Corruption is not something you photograph once and permanently it's eliminated. But the investigation did produce real consequences. City procedures changed, investigations expanded, inspectors were disciplined and prosecuted. State officials investigated tax fraud. Federal officials pursued cases, and the story became a landmark in investigative journalism. But it also became a cautionary tale because the Mirage demonstrated both the power and danger of undercover reporting. The power is obvious. The reporters got evidence that traditional reporting couldn't get. They had the photographs, names, direct encounters, and they got people explaining the system in their own words. But the danger is equally obvious. Once journalists deceive people, they have to defend not only what they discovered, but how they discovered it. And that debate is still alive. Here's where I land on the Mirage. And this is where I think the story gets more interesting than just simply saying journalists bought a bar and caught corrupt people. Because the Mirage raises the question about what journalism is for. If a reporter hears 20 small business owners saying inspectors are demanding money, but no one will go on the record, what is the reporter supposed to do? Publish an article saying 20 business owners anonymously told us city inspectors are corrupt? Maybe. But what happens next? The city will deny it, the inspectors deny it, and business owners remain anonymous. The public is left wondering whether any of it is true. And the Mirage changed that equation. The reporters didn't need victims to risk their businesses. They took the risk themselves. And they documented what happened. And again, if they had been cited or shut down because of the obvious violations, there would be no story. As a small business owner, you work your ass off to make sure that you're compliant. You pay a shit ton of money for permitting and taxes. And it's frustrating if you're the one following the rules and someone else could just hand over a $10 bill and they don't have to keep things up to date. Or that you're running a legitimate business and other businesses are trying to shake you down by the pinballs. And we've talked about that on a previous case that I covered where there was a lot of skimming going on through pinball machines. It happened often. Very involved with the mafia. Anyway, it's exhausting to run a business. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. Entrepreneurship is not for the faint of heart. It's amazing, and I can't imagine living my life in any other way. But it's hard, and the level of responsibility is hefty. And the last thing that you need is somebody trying to shake you down for more money. Trust and believe. The Mirage reporters taking that risk and opening that bar, exposing the rampant corruption, though it changed so much, it doesn't make the deception automatically ethical. It doesn't mean that every undercover investigation is justified. It doesn't mean journalists should simply make up identities when they want to cover a story. But in this case, the reporting produced evidence of a system that had been extraordinarily difficult to document through conventional methods. And they would be putting a lot of people at risk had they been exposed. And that's why even decades later, people are still talking about it. Why I still talk about this very case with my fellow business owners, because I think it's a fascinating story. And there's one final thing that I love about this case, and that's the name, the Mirage. This whole thing was an illusion. It looked like a bar, acted kind of like a bar, and the owners looked like ordinary tavern owners. But they had no clue what they were doing. Bartenders looked like bartenders, but actually were journalists. The repairmen, photographers. The customers and officials entering the tavern thought they were walking into an ordinary business, but they were walking into an investigation. And the most important illusion was the one that the reporters were trying to destroy. The illusion that corruption was just a few isolated bad apples. The Mirage suggested something larger, that corruption could become routine, that it could be normalized, that people would stop thinking of it as corruption at all. It could simply become the way things are done. And that's a much harder fight because when everyone knows the rules, nobody has to say them out loud. And Chicago woke up one morning to discover that the bar down the street wasn't really a bar. It was a newspaper office with a liquor license. The Mirage Tavern is one of those stories that sounds made up. A newspaper buying a bar. It literally sounds like a movie. But it happened. And maybe that's why this story has survived, because the Mirage wasn't really about one corrupt inspector. It wasn't really about one corrupt city. It was about what happens when a system becomes so accustomed to small acts of dishonesty that nobody thinks they're doing anything particularly unusual. The reporters moved on. The city changed, but the question they raised never really disappeared. How much are we willing to tolerate because we're told this is just how things work? My sources were the Chicago Sun-Times, the Chicago Sun-Times Archives, WTTW, WBEZ, the Better Government Association History of the Mirage Tavern Investigation, and Columbia Journalism Review. I'm Erin. That was my case. We are going to post this on our Instagram so you can see the actual pictures. You guys, it's crazy. They had like a full bar of people, regulars and everything. I just can't imagine. As somebody who owns a bar, I'm telling you, I can't imagine having these people stand behind there, literally not knowing how to pour a beer and be investigating the whole time. It just blows my mind. I love this case. I think it's fascinating. I think it is crazy. They literally bought a bar, like bought the bar. I just can't. Anyways, I'm Erin. This has been Murder Not Murdering. Tonight, nobody got murdered, but quite a few reputations got absolutely hammered. Autumn will hate that I said that, but I love my puns and I'm going to do it anyway. Until next time, keep your eyes open and keep asking questions. Thank you so much for listening to us. Check us out on Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, etc. We appreciate all of you, and we'll see you next Tuesday.